And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in the American capital, Ruel Marc-Garrecht, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In Canada's capital, Fen Osler-Hampson, Chancellor's Professor and Director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And with us here in studio, Mohammed Fadl, Professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, Saeed Ranama, Professor of Political Science at York University, and Janice Stein, Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. And it's good to have everybody in the two capitals on this continent in Points Beyond. All of you in the studio, nice to see you again. Let me start by reading something from Al Ahram Weekly that will get our discussion started. This from just a few days ago. Revolutions are never perfect, but some are more imperfect than others. The revolution in Egypt has changed hands and, in the process, unleashed conflicting forces from thugs to theocrats. The bloody clashes in Abbasiyah a week ago gathered everyone who could find a place on the bandwagon. Islamists, thugs, anarchists, jobless youth, hired hoodlums, and pro-Mubarak riot squads. Like other riots before it, victims fell, hundreds of injured were rushed to the hospitals, and barbs were exchanged on TV talk shows and via newspaper statements throughout the nation. If this were the French Revolution of 1789, thousands upon thousands would have been sent to the guillotine to be executed on charges of treason, depending on whose point of view carried the day. Ruel, let's start with you. The news has not been good out of Egypt more recently than not. Have there, in your view, been any positive changes taking place in that country since all this went down 15 months ago?
Yeah, I think quite a lot, actually. I mean, if anyone who watched the 4.5-hour debate between Abdel Moussa and Abdel Fattah, the two primary candidates for the presidency, I think you'd have to say that that was quite something to watch. I mean, I don't think we've seen that before in Egypt, or for that matter anywhere else in the Arab world. There was really no subject that was off limits. It was, I think, quite a profound step for Egypt. So, you know, given the dilapidated state, to be polite, of Egyptian politics, I think the progress that has been made is not insignificant. You still basically have the military and the security services in control. We do not know what the Constitution is going to look like. We don't know what the powers of the president are going to look like. We don't know yet how the civilians are going to deal with the military. And these are very big ifs, but I have to say that what the Egyptians have done so far is certainly noteworthy.
Fen Hampson, that's a fair point about the televised debate. That's unprecedented in Egyptian society, and it did get quite positive reviews from international observers. But take that out of the equation. The last thing that Marc-Garrecht mentioned really is kind of where things are at in Egypt these days, isn't it? And if that's the case, is the news all that good?
Well, there's an enormous amount of instability, and that's likely to continue. I guess what's striking to me is that there does seem to be if you look at who are the front-runner candidates now, the latest Al Ahram poll shows Amir Moussa, former foreign minister, is in the lead somewhere around 40%. And to me, that's a sign that many Egyptians, in a sense, are looking for stability moving forward. They're tired of the street protests that have been ongoing. They're very worried, obviously, about the future of the Egyptian economy. There are many unemployed Egyptians. And I think those real issues are now coming into play in the elections as we move forward.
Mohammed, it is true. There are still people protesting in the streets. There are still people being killed in the streets. What do we take from that?
Well, you know, I'm very happily surprised to find myself in agreement with your first commentator. I think that on balance, notable progress has been achieved, but we have to bear in mind that there are huge problems that still have to be surmounted. After all, healthy societies don't produce revolutions, right? So we can't be unrealistic in our expectations about what could have been achieved in 15 months. I think the fact that there was a parliamentary election that was pulled off relatively successfully is a great plus on the ledger. I think that the fact that it looks like there's going to be a free and fair presidential election is a great plus side on the ledger. Now, of course, none of the substantive problems have been resolved, but the main reason for that is you still don't have a legitimate government in place. The transitional government, as such, have been very weak. they lack legitimacy, they're unable to restore order. So until some semblance of a legitimate government, including a legitimate executive, is restored, it's going to be very difficult to have the Egyptian government move to solve these pressing problems.
They did, Saeed, pull off that parliamentary election that Mohammed just referred to. But some people have pointed out that an unusually large number of the votes went to Islamist parties, and they're not happy about that. Do you share that concern?
Of course. You know, the question, no doubt major changes have happened in Egypt. But now we have a triangular confrontation between the militaries, the Islamists, and the progressive forces, and they are pushing for different directions. Military wants the status quo. Islamists want to push back society backward, you know, and then the progressive forces want to move forward. And now the danger is that the first two, the militarists and the Islamists, would come up with a deal, most probably against those who were and will be in Tahrir Square. And this is the most significant thing. That's why the Egyptian revolution, which from the beginning was in danger because it was aborted, because Egypt, unlike the experience of Iran, the military declared neutrality in the very beginning of the revolution. In Iran of the Shah, 1979, the military declared neutrality at the very last, so the whole regime collapsed. So this became a new strategy for Americans, that instead of collapsing the whole regime, they can get rid of the dictator but maintain the regime. And this is going to happen.
Janice, you get to bat cleanup here, and I want to put to you what I guess a number of people have observed, and that is they're concerned that 2012 Egypt has the potential of going the way that 1979 Iran did. Do you see that?
Probably not, Steve, in all honesty. And count me on the optimistic side of the ledger.
Still?
Yes. We did have a free and fair parliamentary election, as Mohammed said. And, you know, we have a really lively race in Egypt, the presidential race. I think it's not fair to talk about Islamists as if they're all one. In fact, probably the second most popular candidate is a member of the Brotherhood, Abdel Fattah, who broke from the Brotherhood to run, is now a pariah. As far as the official Brotherhood is concerned, has been endorsed by Al-Noor, which is the Salafist party, so those who are actually more Islamists, and the progressives together, because he talks very eloquently about the compatibility of Islam and democracy. So this is a genuinely interesting debate that's going on. The military has stood back, not interfered with the debate. Now, it's true that not one of these candidates, the holdover Mubarak of candidates, of whom there are two, or the Islamists, have taken on the military and taken on their domination of the economy. So all those discussions are ahead, but this is a much more open discussion than many people could have foreseen.
Let me go back to Washington. The Muslim Brotherhood, I guess almost a year and a half ago, was sounding very conciliatory at the time, almost going out of its way to make sure that nobody got overly concerned about what they were saying. They're not sounding as moderate a year and change later. Does that cause you any concern?
Oh, not much. I mean, I think the Brotherhood was always going to attempt to exert greater influence, particularly once it found out what its real electoral strength was. I mean, the Brotherhood exists to implement in its own mind Islamic virtue, and I think it's a pretty serious organization. And I think it's got a great deal of traction within the Islamic, within the Egyptian people. So, you know, I think actually for Egypt, it's a healthier situation to have this tension, to have, you know, democratic debates on what they want Egyptian society to be. The answers to those debates may displease many in the West, but I think it's a very important, essential for the Egyptian people to have these very knockdown, drag-out fights on Islamic law and other very sensitive cultural issues.
Saeed, the Brotherhood, any concerns for you?
Of course, lots of concerns, because you know, many people learn from the experience of Iran. Not only the military, not only Americans, but also the Islamists. And even the progressive forces, the feminists, everybody learned from it. The Islamists now play the moderate card. No doubt, I don't say that Egypt will go the path of Iran. It's impossible, because now the regime stays, the military is there, and also there are lots of still unsuppressed progressive movements. But I think they gradually move toward the direction, and then it all depends. If they could succeed in gaining more power, not only through presidency, but also through the parliament, which they have full control, then there is the danger of they moving toward a situation. Many people compare Egypt to Turkey, sort of moderate, but also there is the option of becoming a Pakistan, It are less chances, but I'm not that optimistic about the Islamists.
That is the thing, Mohammed. Everybody wants to find the example from history that best fits Egypt. Are they going to be Iran? Are they going to be Turkey? Are they going to be something else? Which one? What part of history do you look at and say that looks like it's right?
Well, I think it's always dangerous to look to history to predict the future.
Really?
Yeah,
A lot of people
the
say that's
future is never
exactly-
the same as the past. Never the same as the past, right? But if I were to be a betting man, I would say that Egypt is going to be somewhere between Pakistan and Turkey, right? Where you still you have a continued strong presence of the government, of the military. You have nominal civilian control over large sectors of society, but not completely. And then the hope is, over time, if the civilians can rule effectively and efficiently, that they will get more and more control over the government. So, we will have to see in 40 years, really. It will take a very long time.
Fen Hampson, I don't want to wait 40 years. I want to know today. What do you think?
Well, the comparison I've heard is that this may be a revolutionary situation comparable to what happened in Europe in 1848, which is to say you see a revolution, but then a return to something akin to the Ancien regime. In this case, it would be a pact, as one of the commentators referred to, between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military. And I think for many of the protesters, and certainly the young ones I've talked to who were in Tahrir Square, that is their fear, that when the two elephants start making love in Egyptian politics, it's those who really want to see radical change who are going to get pushed aside in the process.
Janice.
Fen, I think it's right that it's certainly a very, very strong possibility that we get a deal between the Brotherhood and the military, since those are the two strongest institutionalized forces in Egypt. But to call that undemocratic is not right. That is not, first of all, a return to the Ancien regime in Egypt, because the Brotherhood was suppressed, beginning with President Nasser, really, for the last 50 years. So this is a radical change. It's not the radical change that the young, westernized elite, the wild golems, wanted in Tahrir Square. But it is democratic when you look at the vote that the Brotherhood was able to secure, and it's going to be interesting times. It is a much more open process where those who are best institutionalized, best organized, are likely to prevail.
Let me just get Fen a quick reply to that if you want, and then Saeed.
Well, I think I would agree with Janice. One thing we really haven't talked about is the Egyptian economy, which, by the most positive estimates, is going to grow at something like 1.2% this year. You need sustained growth rates around 7% to provide jobs for many of those young people who are entering the labor force. And that's really going to be the issue for whoever is president, whoever is in charge. Can they deliver? The Egyptian economy, they just got an infusion of $1 billion loan from the Saudis. I think the International Monetary Fund is waiting to see what happens in this election before it extends further loans. But this is an economy that is in deep crisis, very high levels of unemployment, and that's going to be the issue for whoever wins this election.
Saeed Ranama.
In response to Janice, we need to define democracy. Usually we reduce democracy into majority vote. I think the other side of democracy, which is so important, particularly nowadays in Middle East, is the minorities' right. I agree that this was democratic in terms of majority vote, but in terms of minorities' right, I'm very worried about the situation of women, about Copts, about many other situations, not only in Egypt, but in all the other parts.
Let me get some feedback from all of you on something that I know one of Egypt's neighbors cares a lot about, and that's Israel, and that's a peace treaty that's lasted for more than 3 decades. Roel Markarek, to you first. Does that peace treaty run the risk of being abrogated depending on who wins the next election?
Sure. I think the odds of some type of referendum on the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty are not small, particularly if Abdel Fattah wins the election. I think certainly the Salafists who've backed him would want to have some type of vote. I suspect the Muslim Brotherhood does too. Whether they go about it right away is an interesting question, but I think down the road, I wouldn't at all be surprised to see that treaty put finally to the vote, which, you know, the treaty was decided by a dictator before, so it's quite understandable they'd want to vote on it. And if it happens to pass, then obviously it will solidify that treaty in a way that hasn't been the case before. And if it fails, then at least we'll have an honest expression for where the Egyptian people are.
Mohammed, where are you on that?
I'm skeptical that any Egyptian government is going to raise this issue in the next 10 or 15 years, just because the economic issues are so pressing, so immediate, and everybody is concerned about them. That's why, generally speaking, I'm indifferent as to the identity of who's in power or who wins, as long as there is formal democratic accountability, because everybody agrees that the economy is the first, second, third, fourth problem facing Egypt, and rebuilding an effective state that can solve those problems is going to be no small challenge. So I don't think any Egyptian government is going to be interested in revisiting the peace treaty. Having said that, since the revolution, there have been 2 countries whose embassies have witnessed mass protests, Saudi Arabia and Israel. And I think that reflects the fact that there are deep grievances against both of those countries among the Egyptian population. And so that is going to have some sort of effect.
Janice, I think if I'm reading between the lines of what Mohammed is saying, he's saying since the economy is so important and since the Americans give billions to Egypt every year, they're not going to risk overruling that treaty because they need that money.
That's part of the story. That's there's no question. We saw that play out, by the way, when Americans were arrested because of their involvement with NGOs, the Republican National Institute. There was a quid pro quo that was very obvious, and everybody found an honorable solution. But there's a bigger issue here, which makes me agree with Mohammed that this is not going to be front and center. Even though for Amr Moussa, this has been an issue for years, ever since the peace treaty was signed.
The secular leader.
Yes, and so he's opposed this treaty, and in fact, he fell out with Sadat precisely over this issue and was exiled to the Arab League. So there's a long history here. But the Egyptian military, whom we haven't talked about, this is an issue that the Egyptian military does not want to touch. They do not, and they do not want to for a very good reason. This works for them. It's worked for them ever since it was signed. Their status inside the country has grown, their pay has grown, their perks have grown, and their domination of the Egyptian economy has grown, and they haven't had to fight a war. So if we think about any kind of deal between anybody and the military as a long transitional phase, which is where we started, it's not the Egyptian military will move heaven and earth to stop any meaningful change in this treaty.
Said, what's your view on this treaty that goes back to Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin and a long time ago?
You know, I agree that no Egyptian government at this stage would want, although they may, under the pressure, you know, they make some changes, but they are not going to confront Israel. They are not going to make big changes for now, depending who comes into power. But this has 2 sides to it. Talking of grievances of Egyptian people toward Israelis, you know, I had a debate with a colleague, and I said that the question was whether Arab Spring is good or bad for Israel. I said, which Israel? Is it Israel of hawks, settlers, or religious fundamentalists? It's very bad. But if it is for Israel of pro-peace, you know, then Arab Spring should be embraced. And that is why they should resolve the Palestinian issue. Palestinian issue is an integral part of the whole thing. It's hidden there. It's in the psyche of the Egyptians and the whole Arab world. So we have to take that into consideration too.
Fan Osler-Hampson, let me get you on the Camp David Accords. What's your view?
Well, I agree with Janice that it's certainly not in Egypt's interest to try to revisit that, and certainly not the military's interest. But having said that, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for political opportunism, for for mischief, particularly a new government that finds itself unable to get a handle on economic issues. There's a long pattern in history of governments that when they can't deal with problems at home, they look for enemies and scapegoats. So I would say moving forward, there's a lot more risk there than there was before.
Let me do one more question on Egypt, and then we're going to go on and talk about Libya. And Ruel, let me put it to you. If Egypt does not remain a secular state, in inverted commas, how might that affect the rest of the region, in your opinion?
Well, I'm not sure Egypt is a secular state now.
That's why I put it in inverted commas.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is the vast majority of the Egyptian people have been living more or less according to Islamic law and custom for quite some time. So, I think the debates, assuming that the military lets loose of Egypt, and I do believe that the chances of a collision actually between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military are quite substantial. But let's just assume the military and the security services, and those two should perhaps be dealt with separately, let go of Egypt, and you begin to have a real parliament. And in that parliament, you have profound debates about the Sharia, about traditional practices. Then I think the impact of that could be fairly large, certainly larger than what you'll see take place in Tunisia. So we'll have to see. First, the parliament, I think, has to become real. As long as it is more or less subservient to the military and the security services, I don't know what that impact outside of Egypt is going to be like.
Last word, Janice.
Two quick things to watch for, Steve. One, what does the Constitution tell us about the relationship between the president and parliament? Something Mohammed raised. We don't know the answer to that. Second thing, how are the Copts, who are 10% of the Egyptian population, Christian Copts, how are they treated in the new Egypt? Those are two good diagnostic indicators.
Badly in old Egypt, right? Badly in old Egypt.
Well, badly and well, depending on which period in old Egypt, right? But badly in the last several years, certainly.
Okay, let's move on now. We're going to talk about Libya and a troubled transition that's happening there. Starting first with this excerpt. Libya's first national democratic elections are scheduled to take place in June, but the ruling Transitional Council is hardly functional, and the country faces a number of major problems. Local councils, which have formed in the cities and regions, enjoy a varying degree of authority depending on the location. The situation is made even more unclear by the fact that various revolutionary forces and militia are in part represented in these local councils. But they also act in part outside of the councils and time and again engage in armed power struggles among themselves. The Transitional Council has not yet been able to place the numerous armed groups and clan militia under the central control of a security committee in Tripoli. But in order to ensure the security of the country and the population, a new security and military apparatus has to be built up. Okay, let's start with this. Fen Osler-Hampson, how does Libya get past all of these tribal militias and regional fighting and somehow come together? Start us off on that.
Well, I'm not sure it's going to be able to do that, and I think this is a case where elections may in fact be premature. There are no central security forces. It's not clear they're going to be able to have an effective election. Many Libyans are actually mystified what they're registering for. I mean, that's borne out in a lot of anecdotal evidence. There are very strong divisions within the country. The ruling council in Benghazi said sometime in March that they were threatening to boycott these elections, which would see representatives going to a constituent assembly who will then form the new government, write a new constitution. I mean, that's a very tall order for a country that is in big trouble.
Ruel, what can you tell us about why the Transitional Council has had such a difficult time removing the arms from the street and establishing some kind of national army or security apparatus?
Well, I mean, I think you have to start first with the basic fact that, Libya, outside of, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, probably had the most Orwellian dictatorship over it for decades. So, I mean, Gaddafi more or less pulverized Libyan society. So it's not at all surprising that the Libyans are are going to have and have had difficulty. I have to say, given how awful Gaddafi's rule was, I would have expected much more mayhem and bedlam and bloodshed than what we've seen. So, you know, Libya is to some extent breaking down into component parts. However, I have to say, I do think the idea of the Libyan national identity is probably stronger than what a lot of people, Western observers, believe. And that is you know, the West has exported nationalism pretty successfully to the Middle East. And despite the serious differences in different parts of Libya and the suspicions and doubts and the tribal nature of much of Libyan society, I suspect that they are going to still come together in some type of national coalition. Again, I would expect it to be very, very messy. But if you just look at someone like, I have to say, like Abdel Karim Belhaj, who could have been really, really awful, and certainly had the background suggesting he was going to be really awful, has done a tolerably decent job in Tripoli. He could have really abused the system, and he hasn't. So with that said, I mean, I remain, you know, somewhat optimistic.
Saeed Redema, what do you say?
Well, I think the main feature of Libyan regime is that they talk of decentralization, but there is no centralization at all for the present regime. You know, I mean, Al Jadid and Al Kib, they have no control over many areas of Libya. So tribalism and also the warlords are controlling different parts. Even the central government cannot have the authority to get back Saif al-Islam, you know, for trial. So this is a weak government, and the election is not going to change anything. I mean, but the main issue is that what NATO did, they made sure that nothing would happen to the continuation of production and supply of Libyan oil.
Let me pick up on that. Did NATO leave too early?
Well, I don't think NATO had the mandate to help set up a transition government, but it seems to me that it's a great mistake that there's not international support for this transition. I mean, I just don't think that the Libyans have enough domestic sort of political capital from leftover from the Gaddafi days to pull this transition off successfully in a timely fashion. That's what concerns me. They are trying in many ways to build a government from scratch. And as Saeed just mentioned, the government is almost non-existent. And it's hard to see how these elections in June is going to change that fundamental problem.
Janice, there are not that many people, presumably in Libya, who have the history of capacity building, institution building that could pull this together right now. No. So where is the rest of the world in helping them to do it?
Well, you know, it's really interesting because truthfully, Libya is just a mess, right? And it has no national institutions of any kind. It had Gaddafi, who systematically destroyed anything that was there. And there were always very strong tendencies, regional tendencies in the history of Libya. So things are frankly really, really very bad, and the arms are still on the streets. But to argue, in fact, that NATO should have stayed longer, I don't agree at all. I mean, we've seen the mess that results when Western whites come in and try to support institution building in the Arab world. That is a recipe for absolute disaster and failure given the history of the Arab world with the West.
So should somebody else have come in afterwards?
It's not even clear from my perspective. You should have gone in, frankly,
yes,
because
exactly.
when
NATO should have gone in to begin with, you know.
Should not have gone in?
No,
well, when you break it, now I think if you spoke to
got to fix it.
You got to fix it, and that's exactly the problem. You know, it'd be interesting because we have no way of knowing, but I suspect that many Libyans would prefer the mess they have now to the regime that NATO got rid of. And that's a fair and legitimate question to ask. I think I agree totally with Fen here. It's way too early for these elections. They're polarizing, if anything. We'd be better off with a much slower transition than we have because there are simply no institutions on the ground. And what we know from elections that were held in Iraq under American sponsorship with institution building and capacity building is that early elections with a proportional representation system make things much worse.
They can. Van Hampson, haven't heard from you yet on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't think we've learned anything from past mistakes on holding premature elections,
Yeah.
and this is a case where it's not going to change anything. But I think there's also a bigger problem here for the international community, and that is that to the extent we see continuing chaos, instability in Libya, it's beginning to export those problems into the neighborhood. There's been a massive outflow of arms, uncontrolled. It's it's one of the reasons why some are saying the government in Mali faced a coup is because rebels were able to get arms from neighboring Libya, and so this is really a case where a failure to try to help Libya get back on its feet is going to have broader consequences. But it's also Hobson's choice. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you stayed there, if NATO had stayed there, it's not clear would have been able to fix the situation.
Well, let me look at a couple of international players. Roel, let me go to you with this in Washington. Russia and China. What role are they playing, and are they playing a constructive role in your view?
I don't think Russia and China play a constructive role anywhere in the Middle East. So I don't see them as at all being helpful. Some places they're less helpful than others. Certainly with the Russians, that's the case in Syria. I really think, I mean, to the extent that there's going to be any constructive aid given, that is going to be done by the West. It's going to be done by the Americans and the Europeans. I don't really see anyone else being a significant player. It's possible through default that the Saudis or the Qataris might help, but I think they're probably just as likely to do harm as they are to do good, probably more likely. So, in Libya is tough. I mean, fortunately, the Libyans do have a functioning oil industry. Eni, the Italian oil industry giant, which is it's the largest investor there, remains fairly optimistic. So as long as the politics do not mess up that industry, the government in Libya will have cash. They have to have a government, and they have to recognize it. I'd have to say, though, I think elections are unavoidable and they are essential. You would prefer to have them later, but I don't see what the center of power is without them, and certainly there's no notion of legitimacy without them. So they may not produce an ideal result, but I don't see how you avoid them, primarily because I don't think Libya, the Libyan people, want to avoid them.
Mohammed.
So with that said, I think the Libyans are going more or less, like everyone else in the Middle East, is going to have to sort of make do with what they've got.
Okay, let me get Mohammed here.
When I suggested that greater international support was needed in Libya, I did not mean to say that had to come from NATO. NATO is not the only international organization in the world.
Who have you got in mind?
The United Nations, the Arab League, but part of it requires the United States helping to motivate regional actors to play a bigger role. Now, part of the problem, and I think one of the tragedies here, is that given the fact that upheaval is spread from one country to the other in the Arab world, Arab countries that could naturally come to the assistance of Libya, for example, Egypt, are too caught up in their own internal problems to be able to offer effective assistance. And I think the United States often can play a catalyzing role, which is much more effective than it does when it plays a direct role.
Saeed.
Well, I mean, anything that we discuss about Libya deals with oil. To begin with, NATO intervened in order to preserve control over oil. In relation to Chinese, Chinese were getting lots of breakthrough through oil industry in Libya, and one of the reasons that they wanted to get rid of China was exactly through this means. And Chinese are very upset because of this, because many of their workers, they had to withdraw, and then now their deals are also off.
Janice.
Yeah, I actually don't think NATO intervened to preserve oil because,
I do.
Well, I'll tell you why I don't. Because actually, if that was the purpose, you didn't have to do anything. Western companies had very good access. There were Western firms on the ground. They're in the desert, frankly. And so this was, from that perspective,
Why Italians did
destabilizing.
not join the company? Because ENI, as was mentioned, ENI had the greatest percentage of its
Yeah, but
foreign
they're
oil
also-
production
but they're
from
also-
Libya. They didn't want to touch it,
Yeah, but there are also other Western companies that are in, and from that perspective, the NATO intervention made no sense. The real reason NATO intervened was because there were 100,000 Benghazis at risk when Gaddafi threatened that his convoys were going to roll down the highway, and the pressure came exactly where we know it came from, Susan Rice.
And thousands of Bahrainis are in danger now. But why NATO does not intervene there?
This was a massacre waiting to happen, and it was Hobson's choice, frankly. Everybody knew it. Putting it back together, as Mohammed said, though, is very, very tough. The UN has a horrible record. I hate to say this as a Canadian. It has a very bad record on the ground. The Arab League, which has actually played a more constructive role in the last year, as Mohammed said, doesn't really have the capacity to come in and help on the ground. So putting this back together is tough.
Hang on, let me give the last word to Fen on this, and then we'll talk Syria.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Fen.
I mean, the fact is the intervention was led by the Europeans and Canada. It's Europe that really should be playing, Europe should be playing a much more constructive role, but it's so focused on its internal problems. I think that's part of Libya's problem right now, is that the neighbors who should be in a position to help can't or won't.
Okay, let's move on and talk Syria. Syria has constantly been in the news over the last several months. It is again today as a result of more violence there yesterday. We're going to roll some tape and then come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
The target of the twin suicide bombs appeared to be a military intelligence building in the heart of the capital. The Interior Ministry said the explosives used weighed more than 1,000 kilograms, the equivalent of 2,200 pounds. State television was showing pictures of a smoking landscape littered with wrecked cars and debris. The ministry said scores of people were killed by the blasts, and it seemed the death toll was likely to climb. By all accounts, the second explosion was the more lethal.
Okay, that was 5 days ago. Then we saw yesterday another couple of dozen Syrian troops killed as a result of more violence going on. We know that there have been hundreds, if not more, of Syrian civilians killed by the regime. We talked, okay, Janice, you first. We talked a moment ago about the world's willingness to intervene to stop a slaughter in Libya, but apparently not here.
Well, you know, it's really interesting because this is a direct follow-on from the story of Libya. Intervening, from my perspective, by the West, all right, would be catastrophic in Syria.
In a way that it wasn't in Libya.
Well, and unfortunately this is, again, not a pretty thing to admit, but largely because the Syrian military is so much more effective, because the Syrians have so much better anti-aircraft systems than the Libyans did, because the Syrians have a much better air force, because it would take months of bombardment, frankly, and you would need boots on the ground. There were, in fact, boots on the ground in Libya, contrary to all the conventional wisdom. And the story of Western boots on the ground in the Arab world is a catastrophic story over and over and over again, and the West should refrain. The West should refrain. There's no gainsaying that 10,000 plus people have already died in Syria and more will die. The ceasefire that Kofi Annan negotiated is a travesty, frankly. It's a joke. But the only people who can do anything about this is the Arab world itself.
Fen Hampson, why yes to Libya and no to Syria?
Well, I think it's fairly obvious that it's not clear that military intervention is going to solve anything in Syria, which has become, to all intents and purposes, a proxy war among some of its key neighbors, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and others. So, you know, military intervention doesn't necessarily solve anything, as we've seen on more than one occasion in recent history. Having said that, there are other ways to intervene through diplomacy. You know, yes, the Annan mission has not been a success. I would agree with that. It was doomed to failure from the beginning. But one of the problems in Syria is that the opposition is fragmented, is divided. there's certainly a role for diplomacy there to try to bring the opposition together so that they can bring effective pressure to bear on the regime. And it's one of the reasons why Assad feels he has the upper hand, is precisely because the opposition is divided.
Ruel, is there an argument to be made here for Western military intervention in Syria?
Oh, a big one. I mean, I think it's probably the easiest strategic one that there is actually in the Middle East. The downing of the Assad regime would be a significant blow to Iran. That is a good thing, particularly with Iran on the threshold of getting a nuclear weapon. I think unless this savagery stops in Syria, you are asking for an invitation for a Sunni backlash against the Alawi, which could be quite bloody. Actually, I don't think there has been any proxy war in Syria. What you have seen is you've seen the Iranians and the Russians arm the Syrians, and you've seen the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and certainly the Americans just dawdle on the sidelines. And I regret to say that I don't think the Americans, I mean, if there ever was an opportunity for the CIA to do something, as reluctant as that institution is to engage in covert action, this one is almost tailor-made, given the porousness of the border and how stretched and weak the Alawite forces are inside of Syria. You could really bring a lot of pressure to bear on them quite quickly. But I don't see that happening. I think the Obama administration won't do anything up until November. And I think the experience in Libya, though really not all that large, was quite traumatic for the Obama administration, and I just don't see them doing much. So I would expect the bloodshed to go up quite substantially in Syria. The regime might actually win. It's possible they could that they could kill this off, and if they don't, they are certainly setting it up for, I think, a major cataclysm for the Alawi community.
Saeed Ranama.
Well, of all the theaters of conflict that we are discussing, Syria is the most complicated and the most dangerous, and because of a variety of reasons. Partly, as was mentioned, you know, it has got the linkage with Iranian regime. Actually, the reason why Arab League went after Bashir Assad because of its good relationship with Iran, you know. The reverse what happened in relation to Bahrain, you know. As soon as Bahrain was in danger, they went and supported Bahrain. Also, Bashar Assad has enormous internal support yet, you know, not only about Alawis, you know, about the traditional elite, you know, military and other things. Also, its linkages with Hezbollah and other things, but the most significant one is the relationship with Iran. Everybody knows, Iranian regime knows, that if Syria falls, one of the biggest cards of Iran is lost. That is why Iran is not going to let it happen, and Assad regime is not going to let it happen, and there is a danger that if really they are pushed further, they may even get involve Israel in a sense, you know. Bashar Assad can turn this into Israeli conflict, and then as soon as Israel enter the war, you know, I mean, these are the scenarios that, I don't say this will happen, but these are the possibilities. Then Iran also will see that it's in danger, so you have got getting into a regional war that has got Hezbollah already it has a spillover to Tripoli. You know, yesterday there were gunfights in Tripoli. So it is the most dangerous one, and it's not going to be resolved that easy. But my anticipation is that I think eventually they will find some sort of solution dealing with this dictator and state, unfortunately.
Mohammed, let's just understand what the options are here. We've heard, you know, Janice and others say absolutely no to military engagement, can't be done. We've heard Ruel said there's an absolutely good argument to be made to get in there. Where are you?
I'm not a military expert. I can't speak about the feasibility of it. I think the politics of it are very bad. So I wouldn't counsel, you know, a military campaign, covert or overt, against the Syrian regime as much as I despise it. I agree with almost everything that people have said regarding the nature of the regime and the disastrous decisions that it's taken.
Everybody does, but what,
Right.
I mean,
Now,
you have to take the next step and
right.
say this is a
Well,
despicable regime and therefore we have to
that,
do...
I don't think that it's possible for this regime to survive in the long term. The only question is when it goes. The only thing that I would just throw it on the table, even though I think it's a small possibility, but I think it's actually the most optimistic scenario. The only optimistic scenario that I see is if the Iranians realize that supporting this regime is a disaster for them and that they cut their losses and withdraw support. Now, when I was in the Arab world last summer, they were taking huge amount of egg on their face for standing beside the Syrian regime.
The Iranians.
The Iranians. And so this is causing huge amounts of losses for them in sort of soft power, so to speak, throughout the Arab world. And I think at some point in time, it's possible, I'm not saying plausible, that the Iranians might realize that they really have to let go of this regime.
You know, an optimistic and a pessimistic scenario. The optimistic one is the one that Mohammed just laid out, in which not only the Iranian regime, which has been hugely criticized for what it's doing in Syria, but the Russians and the Chinese as well, particularly the Russians. It's not a comfortable position for Putin to be explicitly supporting a regime that continues to massacre its own citizens. That, particularly Iran and Russia, take just one step back. And that would probably be enough to realign the forces inside. But there's wishful thinking there to some degree.
Let me follow up on
something. Let me tell you the pessimistic one, though.
All right, go ahead.
But that's the role of diplomacy, Janice.
Yeah, well, we have a regional
war. That's the role
war.
of diplomacy to bring the Russians on side, because
yes,
clearly,
it is.
clearly the status quo does not benefit them.
That's right, and
that's
and that's where there is room for constructive diplomacy. It's not inside Syria.
Absolutely.
It's with the powers around Syria. The pessimistic
Absolutely.
scenario, and we're seeing that already, it spills over into Lebanon, which is very dangerous. It spreads beyond, it spills over into Turkey, where there's a very, very large Alawite community bordering Syria. And you could easily imagine the conflict spreading and diffusing in the region, which creates a nightmare scenario.
Fenn, follow up on your thought?
Well, just on the military intervention issue there, important to remember that Assad has an army somewhere around 300,000, very well equipped, very well trained. You know, this isn't Gaddafi, who didn't have much of an army and took 6 months of NATO bombing to get rid of him. In the Syrian case, you would almost certainly have to put ground forces in there. And you know, he will be difficult. He would be very difficult to pry loose.
Ruel, let me do a follow-up.
One shouldn't underestimate the risks of military intervention there.
Understood, but I want to do a follow-up with Ruel, who mentioned that until the American election is decided in November, we're not going to see anything coming from an American administration. But how about after November? If Mitt Romney becomes president, Ruel, do you have any reason to believe that he might be more activist, militarily speaking, in the Middle East?
Well, that's a good question. I can't imagine he would be less. So, you know, obviously foreign policy has not been Mitt Romney's Trump suit. So he seems to be visibly not uncomfortable, but he tends to avoid discussing foreign policy. However, I suspect that he would be more inclined than President Obama in doing something. Again, it's entirely possible that the regime will be successful in killing off the rebellion by next November. We just don't know. I have to say I have been astonished by the tenacity of the Sunni rebellion of young men to go out time and time again to get slaughtered, which is basically what happens unless these folks are armed. So I would expect that, I mean, the Obama administration has been able to absorb, what's the toll now? It's at least 10,000. Yep. Administration inside figures think that number is more likely 15,000. It's been able to absorb that loss. I suspect you could double that and it could still absorb it. So I think that the death toll inside the country would really have to get quite high before the Obama administration would do anything. The Romney administration might. There's a chance that it would, but you know, difficult to tell until he wins the election.
Sure. Well, we should say for the record, he's leading in the polls today. First time he's 3 points up on Obama, and that's irrelevant, means nothing. We're too far away. Just thought I'd point it out. Saeed.
Well, just, I mean, as I mentioned, considering all the balance of power regionally, internationally, pro and against Assad regime, I think most probably Americans and others and NATO and others would not be able to either deal with regime change or even changing the dictator, maintaining the regime. So they have to move to the third option that they have had to make a deal with the dictator. Particularly, I mean, even we use diplomacy for Russians. Russians would also would push for this. So there would be a deal that somehow the dictator makes some minor changes and then
But stays.
Stays.
Yeah, I think it's too far gone for that, and I think that you have a mobilized Sunni opposition inside Syria that has repeatedly shown its unwillingness to make a deal. And that's a very important fact on the ground, and that opposition is going to continue. So when we actually talk about intervention, we've talked about intervention directly in Syria, and I think we're all agreed that that would be a very bad option. There are other forms of intervention.
We're not all agreed.
Okay, most of us are agreed. There is other forms of intervention that we haven't talked about, such as arming, and some of that is already going on. Arming the Sunni opposition through the Turkish border, which is an open, porous border.
Opposition?
Well, here's where the proxy war really does matter, and this is the They are being armed already.
Yes.
And in
That's
fact,
the reality.
That's right. And which fragment of the opposition you choose depends on who is doing the arming. And if you're actually looking at what's happening on the ground, there is intervention already, and there are many interveners.
Okay, let me get Fen Hampson on this, though. Do you see a scenario whereby Assad gets to continue killing people, but just not at a rate at which the rest of the world intervenes, and therefore, even after all of this diplomacy, he gets to keep his job at the end of the day?
No. I think Assad has to go. The question is, how does he go? Some have talked about a Yemeni-style transition where he would relinquish the reins of power, or his own people decide that he's become too much of a liability and they want to get rid of him. I mean, it's important to remember that his father governed quite successfully by bringing others. Assad Sr. had a Sunni prime minister. He reached out to others. One of the characteristics of the younger Bashar Assad is the way he's ruled is he's put his family in key positions of influence, of power in business and industry.
The father was also prepared to kill tens of thousands of people to stay in power. Let's not forget that.
Yes, he was. But he was ruthless, but he was also a power broker. And the younger Assad has shown no evidence that he is a power broker. It's one of the reasons why this coalition has fallen apart.
I'm going to give. Forgive me for jumping in, Fen. I got 20 seconds left, and I want to give it to Mohammed because I remember when we did programs when the Arab Spring first broke, and I remember how giddy with enthusiasm you were. That this could go very well. Mm-hmm. Okay, 15 months later, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling the same way, but my timeline is realistic because I believe in the course of human events, you don't snap your finger and everything changes. As I said, Egypt will not turn into Canada overnight. That's why I keep talking about a generation of change, right? And having an opportunity to govern yourself is a prerequisite for social, political, and economic progress. You cannot have social and economic progress if you can't govern yourself, full stop. So.
Let me thank Ruel Mark Garect, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, for joining us tonight. Fen Osler-Hampson, Director of the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, on the line from Ottawa. And here in studio, Janice Stein from the Monk School, Mohammed Fadel from the University of Toronto, Saeed Ranama, York University. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.